He thought no woman could survive a single night in that room. But by sunrise, everything he believed would begin to fracture. The mansion stood on a quiet hill overlooking Seoul, its glass walls reflecting the cold glow of city lights below, a place built on control, precision, and silence. Except for one room at the far end of the second floor, where silence had never lasted longer than a few seconds. Inside that room were the twins. Two small children who had turned every caregiver before them into a story whispered in the staff quarters. Women who arrived confident and left before dawn with hollow eyes and shaking hands, some quitting before their first paycheck, others refusing to even speak about what happened behind that locked door. Kang Jae-min, the man who owned the mansion, did not believe in exaggeration, but even he had stopped asking questions after the 12th nanny walked out before sunrise. He simply signed the termination papers, one after another, his expression unchanged, his expectations lowered not out of doubt, but out of calculation. Weakness revealed itself quickly in his world. That night, rain tapped softly against the windows as a new figure stood at the entrance, her reflection faint in the polished marble floor. Mai adjusted the strap of her worn bag, her breath steady, but her hands betraying her with a slight tremble. She had been rejected from 3 jobs that week alone, turned away with polite smiles that never reached the eyes, her size judged before her voice was even heard, her skin making her stand out in ways she had learned not to question anymore. This job had been her last option. The pay was more than anything she had ever been offered, enough to keep her from slipping further into a life that was already closing in around her. A housekeeper led her through the mansion without warmth, without conversation, heels clicking in a rhythm that felt almost like a countdown. "You stay in the room," the woman said flatly, stopping at a heavy wooden door. "You do not leave until morning." Mai frowned slightly, her brows knitting together as she processed the words. "What if you stay," the housekeeper repeated, already turning away. The door opened, and the sound hit her instantly. It wasn't just crying. It was layered, chaotic, sharp in a way that made her chest tighten. 2 voices, overlapping, rising and falling without pattern, filling the air like a storm that had been building for hours. The door closed behind her with a quiet, final click. For a moment, Mike didn't move. The room was dim, shadows stretching across expensive furniture that no child seemed to care about. Toys were scattered, some overturned, others untouched. The twins were on opposite sides of the room, both restless, both overwhelmed in ways that didn't need explanation, only presence. One knocked over a small chair, the other covered their ears, rocking slightly. Mai swallowed, her heart beating faster now, her instinct pulling her in 2 directions at once. Step forward or step back. Somewhere beyond the walls, unseen cameras watched in silence. And in another room, Kang Jae-min stood still, his gaze fixed on a screen, waiting not for success, but for the exact moment she would fail. The first 10 minutes felt longer than any hour Mai had ever lived through, the sound pressing against her ears, crawling under her skin, testing the edges of her patience as the twins moved without rhythm, without pause, one pacing in tight circles while the other shifted between restless motion and sudden stillness, their energy filling the room in waves that refused to settle. Her instinct told her to speak, to correct, to calm them with words the way most people would, but something held her back, something quiet beneath the noise that told her this was not a moment for control, but for understanding. She took one slow step forward, then another, careful not to move too fast, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the polished floor, her hands open at her sides, not reaching, not demanding. One of the children glanced at her briefly, eyes sharp, searching, then looked away just as quickly, the connection fragile and fleeting. The other continued rocking, hands pressed against their ears, as if the world itself had become too loud to bear. Mai felt her chest tighten, not from fear but from recognition. She had seen this before. Years ago, in a smaller apartment far from places like this, with walls that did not shine and floors that creaked under every step, she had sat beside someone who moved the same way, who reacted to the world as if it came in too fast, too strong, too much. Her younger brother had been like that. Not broken, not difficult, just overwhelmed in ways no one around them had understood. She remembered the long nights, the moments when nothing worked, when voices only made things worse, when even light felt like pressure. She remembered learning, slowly, painfully, that sometimes the best thing you could do was not to fix the moment, but to sit inside it with them. The memory settled into her like an anchor. The noise in the room did not stop, but it began to feel less like chaos and more like a pattern she could follow. She lowered herself to the floor, not too close, not too far, placing herself where both children could see her without feeling cornered. She did not speak. She did not reach out. Instead, she exhaled slowly, letting her breathing become steady, deliberate, a quiet rhythm that filled the space between the noise. Seconds passed, then minutes. One of the twins slowed slightly, their movements losing a bit of their urgency, their eyes flicking toward her again, curious now instead of guarded. The other shifted, their hands lowering just a fraction from their ears, as if testing whether the world had changed. Somewhere beyond the walls, the cameras captured everything, every small shift, every pause, every breath. Kang Jimin leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, his fingers resting against the edge of the desk as he watched the screen. He had seen women try to take control, to impose structure, to raise their voices, to fill the room with instructions that only made things worse. He had seen frustration, fear, even quiet resentment. But this was different. This woman was not trying to win the moment. She was waiting inside it. Back in the room, I began to hum, soft at first, almost too quiet to notice. The melody simple, steady, something that carried no demand, no expectation, just presence. The sound did not overpower the room. It blended into it, weaving through the sharp edges of noise until those edges began to soften. The child who had been pacing slowed further, their steps losing urgency, their breathing evening out just enough to be felt. The other leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on her now, drawn not by force, but by something familiar in the calm she carried. I kept her gaze gentle, not locking onto them, not turning the moment into something heavy, just staying there. Grounded, patient, present. And for the first time that night, the room did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something that might, slowly, begin to settle. The shift was so subtle that anyone who had not been watching closely would have missed it, but Kang Jae-min did not miss anything, especially not inside his own house, especially not when it came to his children. And as he leaned slightly closer to the monitor, he noticed the exact moment the room changed, not in volume, but in weight, as if something unseen had eased its grip on the air. The child who had been pacing stopped completely, not abruptly, but gradually, like a storm losing its strength, their small frame still for the first time since the door had closed, their eyes fixed on me with a focus that had not been there before. The other child shifted closer, not touching her, not yet, but no longer retreating into themselves, their hands resting in their lap instead of covering their ears, their breathing slower now, more even, as if they were beginning to trust the quiet she was offering. I did not react to the change with excitement or relief. She did not rush forward or try to claim the moment. She simply continued, her humming steady, her posture relaxed, her presence consistent, because she understood something most people did not. Progress in moments like this was fragile, and the fastest way to lose it was to treat it like a victory. Minutes passed, stretching into something softer, something calmer. The tension in the room unwinding thread by thread until even the shadows seemed less sharp. One of the twins took a small step toward her, hesitant, testing, their movement careful, as if expecting the world to push back. I lowered her voice slightly, the melody shifting just enough to meet them where they were, not pulling them forward, but inviting them to come closer on their own. The child sat down a few feet away from her, their gaze still fixed, their body language no longer defensive, but curious. The other followed, slower, quieter, settling near her side without touching, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance. Somewhere deep in her chest, I felt something tighten and release at the same time, a memory overlapping with the present, the image of her younger brother sitting just like this years ago, unsure of the world but drawn to the one person who had chosen to stay instead of walk away. She let her humming fade into silence, not abruptly, but naturally, allowing the quiet to hold itself without her guiding it. The room did not collapse back into chaos. It held. The stillness remained. One of the children leaned slightly against her arm, tentative, almost questioning, as if asking permission without words. Ma did not move immediately. She waited, letting them decide, letting the moment belong to them. Then, slowly, she shifted just enough to support the contact, her arms steady, her presence unchanged. The second child followed, resting closer, their head lowering as exhaustion finally caught up with them, their small body relaxing in a way that had likely not happened in a long time. In the control room, Kang Jae-min straightened, something in his expression tightening, not with anger, not with doubt, but with something far less familiar. He had built his world on control, on rules, on systems that ensured outcomes could be predicted and managed, but what he was watching now did not follow any of those rules. This was not control. This was patience. And patience was something he had never trusted, because patience required letting go of power, even if only for a moment. Back in the room, Ma remained exactly where she was, sitting on the floor with two children leaning against her, their breathing slow and steady, their bodies finally at rest. Her own back ached, her legs beginning to feel the strain of staying still for so long. But she did not shift, did not adjust, because she knew that even the smallest movement could break what had taken so much to build. Outside, the rain softened, the city lights flickering faintly through the glass. And for the first time since the night had begun, the mansion felt quiet, not because someone had forced it to be, but because someone had finally understood how to listen. Time moved differently inside that room, stretching and softening until the sharp edges of the night seemed to fade into something almost gentle, and I could feel it in the way the children leaned into her now without hesitation, their weight no longer tense or uncertain, but trusting, their small bodies rising and falling with slow, even breaths that filled the quiet like a steady rhythm. She had not realized how much energy she had been holding until that moment, how carefully she had controlled every movement, every breath, every shift in her voice, and now that the storm had passed, her own body began to feel the strain, her shoulders heavy, her legs numb beneath her, but she did not move, not even an inch, because she understood that this calm was not something she could take for granted. It had to be protected. Across the mansion, Kang Jae-min had not left the screen. Hours had passed, the rain outside easing into a faint mist, the city lights dimming as night slowly gave way to the earliest hint of morning. But he remained exactly where he was, standing in silence, watching a scene that refused to fit into any logic he trusted. He had expected patterns, behaviors he could analyze, outcomes he could predict, but there was nothing predictable about what he was seeing now. This woman had not followed any method he recognized. She had not imposed control. She had not demanded obedience. She had simply stayed. And somehow, that had been enough. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in something deeper, something he could not name, a quiet resistance to the realization forming in his mind that perhaps the problem had never been the children. Back in the room, one of the twins stirred slightly, their head shifting against Maya's arm, a small sound escaping their lips as they adjusted, not in distress, but in comfort, like someone settling into a place that finally felt safe. The other followed, their hand curling loosely against the fabric of her sleeve, holding on without gripping, without fear. Ma lowered her gaze, watching them carefully, her expression soft, her breathing still slow and steady, matching theirs without thinking, because this was not something she was doing anymore. It was something she was sharing. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a second, just long enough to feel the quiet settle inside her as well, to feel the weight of the night begin to lift, replaced by something warmer, something steadier. She had come here expecting to endure, to survive a single night in a place that had already defeated so many before her. But she had not expected this, had not expected to feel needed in a way that went beyond a paycheck or a job description. These children had not needed control. They had needed someone who would not leave when things became difficult. Someone who would not measure their worth by how easy they were to handle. The thought lingered in her chest as she opened her eyes again, her gaze moving briefly toward the closed door, aware that beyond it, this world belonged to someone else, someone who had built it on rules she did not fully understand. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps paused, then continued, quiet, deliberate, as if even the staff had sensed that something inside that room had changed. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first light of morning began to touch the edges of the curtains, a faint glow that crept into the room without disturbing the stillness, illuminating the scene in a way that made it feel almost unreal. 2 children, finally at rest. A woman who had not walked away, and a night that, for the first time, had not ended in failure. In the control room, Kang Jimin exhaled slowly, his hand lowering from the edge of the desk as he straightened, his eyes still fixed on the screen, but his thoughts no longer as certain as they had been when the night began. He had been waiting for the moment she would break. Instead, he had witnessed something else entirely. And for the first time in a long time, he did not know what would happen next. The first light of morning did not rush into the room. It crept in slowly, stretching across the floor in thin lines that grew brighter with each passing minute, touching the edges of furniture, softening shadows, revealing a scene that had never existed in this house before. And for a long time, nothing moved. Maya remained exactly where she had been, her back pressed lightly against the wall, her arms supporting the quiet weight of 2 children who had finally surrendered to rest, their breathing steady, their faces calm in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to the space around them. The silence was not empty. It was earned. Outside the room, the mansion had already begun to wake. Staff moved carefully through hallways, their voices low, their footsteps measured, as if the entire house understood that something fragile still existed behind. That closed door. No one knocked. No one interrupted. And in the control room, Kang Jimin stood for a moment longer before finally turning away from the screen, his movements slow, deliberate, his expression unchanged, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the certainty he had carried into the night. He walked the length of the corridor toward the twins' room without announcing himself, his presence enough to shift the air around him, even when he said nothing. The door stood closed, exactly as it had been hours before, but everything beyond it was different now. He paused just outside, his hand hovering near the handle, not from hesitation, but from calculation, as if even this simple action required a level of awareness he had not needed before. Then, quietly, he opened it. The scene inside did not greet him with noise or disorder. It met him with stillness. He stepped in without a sound, his eyes moving immediately to the center of the room. And for the first time, his control faltered. Not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that he stopped mid-step, his breath pausing for just a fraction of a second. The twins were asleep, not exhausted in the way he had seen before, not collapsed after hours of struggle, but resting, their bodies relaxed, their expressions unguarded, their small hands still loosely holding onto the fabric of Maya's sleeve, as if letting go was no longer necessary. And she was still there. She had not moved. Her posture was steady, her eyes open now, watching him as he entered, not with fear, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness that made no attempt to defend or explain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room held its silence, thick and steady, as if even words might disturb what had been built overnight. Kang Jimin's gaze shifted from the children to her, studying her not as an employee, not as another temporary solution, but as something he had not yet defined. He had expected to find failure. He had prepared for it. Instead, he was standing in front of something that had undone every assumption he had made. His voice, when it finally came, was low, controlled, but no longer distant. Why did you not leave? The question was simple, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said that night. Mai held his gaze for a second, then glanced down briefly at the children, her expression softening in a way that answered part of the question before she even spoke. Because they did not need someone to control them, she said quietly, her voice calm, steady. They needed someone who would stay. The words settled into the room without force, without challenge, but they did not fade. They remained, filling the space between them in a way that neither of them could ignore. Kang Jae-min did not respond immediately. He looked back at the twins, then at her again, and something in his expression shifted, not enough to be called emotion, but enough to break the distance he had maintained for so long. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, then turned slightly toward the door, his voice returning, but carrying something new beneath it. From today, he said, pausing just long enough for the words to land, no one replaces you. And with that, he stepped out of the room, leaving behind the quiet, the morning light, and the one person who had done what no one else had been able to do. Not by force, not by skill alone, but by something far rarer in his world. She had stayed. The door closed behind Kang Jae-min with the same quiet precision it had opened, but the silence he left behind was not the same silence that had existed before he entered. It carried weight now, something unseen but undeniable, settling into the room like a presence that would not easily fade. Mai did not move immediately after he left, her body still anchored to the moment, her arms steady beneath the gentle weight of the twins, her breathing aligned with theirs, as if any shift might unravel what had taken the entire night to build. She had heard his words, understood them, but they did not register as victory, not in the way most people would have felt them. This was not about recognition. It was about responsibility. Slowly, carefully, she adjusted her position just enough to ease the tension in her back, supporting the children without waking them, her movements deliberate, controlled, guided by instinct rather than thought. One of the twins stirred slightly, their fingers tightening for a brief second against her sleeve before relaxing again, their trust unbroken. She let out a quiet breath. She had been holding for hours, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, her gaze soft as she looked down at them. In the hallway, word had already begun to spread. The staff did not need confirmation. They had seen the monitors. They had watched the same footage their employer had watched, and the disbelief that moved through the mansion was quiet but unmistakable. No one spoke loudly. No one questioned openly. But the glances exchanged between them carried everything that needed to be said. She stayed. That fact alone was enough to disrupt the patterns they had come to accept. By mid-morning, the house had returned to its routine, but something underneath it had shifted. When the door to the twins' room finally opened again, it was not with urgency, not with expectation of failure, but with a kind of cautious respect. A housekeeper stepped in first, her expression neutral, but her eyes immediately scanning the room, pausing when she saw the children still resting, still calm, her posture stiffening slightly as if unsure how to react to something that had never happened before. Ma met her gaze briefly, not challenging, not seeking approval, simply present. They just fell asleep, she said quietly, her voice carrying no pride, no explanation beyond the truth itself. The housekeeper nodded once, slower than usual, then stepped back, as if instinctively giving space to something she did not fully understand. Later, when the twins woke, it did not happen all at once. It began with small movements, a shift in breathing, a slight stretch of fingers, eyes opening not in panic but in awareness. They did not pull away from Mai. They did not retreat into themselves. They remained close, their expressions calm, curious, as if trying to understand why this moment felt different from all the others that had come before. Mai did not rush them. She did not fill the space with questions or instructions. She simply stayed where she was, offering the same steady presence that had carried them through the night. One of them looked up at her, studying her face in silence, then leaned slightly closer, resting against her again, as if confirming that she was still there. The other followed, quieter, but just as certain. And somewhere down the hall, Kang Jae-min paused in his steps for a brief moment, his attention drawn not by sound, but by the absence of it. No shouting, no chows, just quiet. He did not turn back. He did not need to. For the first time, he knew exactly what was happening inside that room. And more importantly, he understood that it was no longer something he could control. And for a man like him, that realization should have been unacceptable. Instead, it felt like something else entirely. Something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Not control, not power, but trust. By the second day, the mansion no longer felt like a place waiting for failure, but like a place quietly observing something it did not yet understand. And that change could be felt in the smallest details, in the way footsteps slowed near the twins' door, in the way voices lowered without being asked, in the way even the air seemed to pause when I walked through the hall with the children close beside her. She did not walk ahead of them, and she did not pull them along. She moved at their pace, adjusting without effort, her presence steady, her attention divided but never scattered. The twins followed her not because they were told to, but because they chose to, their movements still cautious, still unpredictable at times, but no longer disconnected from the world around them. When one of them hesitated, stopping mid-step as if something unseen had caught their attention, I stopped too. She did not rush them. She did not correct them. She waited, her body language calm, her silence patient, until they found their way back to her on their own. It was not control. It was alignment. In the dining room, the staff stood a little straighter when she entered, their eyes flicking toward the children with a kind of disbelief they tried to hide, because they had seen these same children reject every attempt at routine, every structure imposed on them, every person who had tried to fit them into a system that had never been built for them. But now, they sat at the table, not perfectly still, not silent in the way some might expect, but present, engaged in their own quiet way, their hands no longer restless, their attention no longer scattered beyond reach. Ma did not force conversation. She did not fill the silence with instructions. She placed a glass of water within reach, adjusted a chair slightly, and let the moment unfold without pressure. One of the twins tapped the table lightly, a small, repetitive motion, and instead of stopping it, Ma mirrored the rhythm softly with her fingers, turning it into something shared instead of something corrected. The movement slowed. The tension faded. Across the room, Kang Jimin stood near the window, his posture composed, his presence as controlled as ever, but his attention fixed on a scene he had never expected to witness. He had built systems to manage risk, to eliminate unpredictability, to ensure that every part of his world operated within boundaries he could define, but what he was seeing now did not follow any of those rules. This was not management. This was understanding. His gaze shifted briefly to Mai, studying her not for weakness, not for error, but for something far more difficult to measure. Consistency. She had not changed from the moment she entered his house. She had not adapted herself to his expectations. She had remained exactly who she was, and somehow that had been enough to reach what no one else had been able to reach. Later that afternoon, in the quiet of the hallway, one of the senior staff members approached him, their voice careful, respectful, but carrying the weight of a question that had been building since the night before. "Sir, should we begin adjusting the schedule for the children?" The implication was clear. Structure, routine, control. Kang Jae-min did not answer immediately. His eyes remained forward, his expression unreadable, but his silence was no longer the same kind of silence he had used before. It was not dismissal. It was consideration. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, measured, but different in a way that only someone who knew him well would notice. "No," he said simply. The staff member hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised, then nodded and stepped back. Kang Jimin remained where he was, his gaze drifting once more toward the room where the twins now sat with Mai, their quiet presence filling the space in a way that did not need to be controlled. For the first time, he was not thinking about how to fix what had always been seen as a problem. He was beginning to understand that it had never been a problem to fix. It had been something to listen to, and she had been the first person who actually did. By the end of the week, the mansion no longer reacted to the twins with quiet tension. It adjusted around them, and that difference was not announced. It was felt in the way doors were left slightly open instead of firmly closed, in the way footsteps no longer paused in hesitation, but moved naturally through the halls, in a way the staff began to anticipate rather than avoid. And at the center of that shift was my not commanding it, not directing it, but shaping it simply by being consistent in a way that did not change from room to room or from person to person. She did not perform calmness when others were watching and abandon it when they were not. She carried it the same way everywhere, steady, grounded, unshaken. The twins had begun to mirror that stability in ways that were small but undeniable. They still moved differently from other children, still responded to the world in rhythms that did not always align with expectation, but they were no longer disconnected from it. When they walked through the garden for the first time, the space wide and open around them, they did not retreat or become overwhelmed. They paused, observed, adjusted, their attention moving slowly across the environment as if mapping it in their own way. I stayed beside them, not guiding their steps, not pointing out what they should notice, but allowing them to explore without interruption. When one of them stopped at the edge of a small stone path, staring at the pattern beneath their feet, she stopped too. She did not rush them forward. She did not break the moment. She waited. The other twin crouched down beside the first, tracing the lines with their fingers, and for a brief second, something almost invisible passed between them, a shared understanding that did not need words. Across the yard, Kang Jimin stood at a distance, his posture relaxed but his attention fixed, watching not just the children, but the way Mai moved within their world without trying to reshape it. He had spent years building systems that demanded adaptation, expecting everyone who entered his space to adjust to the structure he had created, but what he was seeing now was something entirely different. She had not adapted the children to the environment. She had allowed the environment to meet them where they were. That realization settled heavily in his chest, not as a challenge to his authority, but as a quiet correction he had not known he needed. Later that afternoon, a visitor arrived, someone from his extended circle, dressed in the same polished confidence that defined the world he operated in, their presence sharp against the calm that had begun to define the house. Their eyes moved quickly, taking in everything, the space, the staff, the subtle shifts that had occurred, and then finally landing on the twins sitting near the window with my close by. Their movements calm, their energy contained in a way that seemed almost impossible given what had once been said about them. "I heard you were having trouble," the visitor said casually, their tone light but edged with curiosity, as if expecting to see evidence of something unresolved. Kang Jae-min did not answer immediately. His gaze remained on the children. On the quiet way, one of them leaned slightly toward Mai, their hand resting near hers without hesitation. "Not anymore," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that had not been there before. The visitor followed his gaze, their expression shifting, confusion replacing the certainty they had arrived with. What changed? The question lingered in the air, simple, direct, but not easy to answer in the way his world usually demanded. Kang Jae-min looked at Mai for a brief moment, then back at the twins, his silence stretching just long enough to carry meaning before he spoke again. "Nothing," he said quietly. "We stopped trying to change them." The words settled into the space with a weight that did not need explanation. The visitor said nothing more. They did not need to, because in that moment, it was no longer a question of what had been fixed. It was a recognition of what had finally been understood. The change did not arrive with an announcement. It did not come with a moment that could be clearly marked or measured, but it settled into the house the way morning light settles into a room, quietly, steadily, until everything looked different without anyone being able to point to the exact second it happened. Days turned into a rhythm that no longer felt forced, and within that rhythm, the twins moved with a sense of belonging that had never existed before. Their presence no longer something the house adapted around out of caution, but something it accepted as part of its natural order. They still had moments when the world pressed too hard against them, when sounds became too sharp or movements too fast, but those moments no longer spiraled into something unmanageable. They paused, they adjusted, and most importantly, they knew where to look. They looked for Mai, and she was always there, not hovering, not controlling, not anticipating every need before it appeared, but present in a way that allowed them to find her on their own terms, to return to her when they needed grounding, to trust that she would not disappear when things became difficult. In the weeks that followed, that trust grew into something stronger, something visible in the smallest gestures, in a way one of them would instinctively reach for her sleeve when entering a new space, or the way the other would sit closer to her during quiet moments, not out of fear, but out of familiarity. Across the mansion, the shift continued, subtle but undeniable. The staff no longer spoke of the twins in hushed tones or avoided their presence with careful distance. They engaged cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, guided not by instruction, but by observation, learning from the one person who had never treated the children as something to be managed. Kang Jae-min watched all of it without interference. He did not issue new rules. He did not restructure the system he had built. Instead, he allowed something unfamiliar to take its place, something that did not rely on control, something that could not be enforced or commanded. He allowed it to exist. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the skyline and the glass walls of the mansion reflected the fading light, he found himself standing in the doorway of the twins' room once again, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Inside, the children sat on the floor with Mai, a quiet activity spread between them. Something simple, something that required no instruction, their attention steady, their movements unhurried. He did not step in immediately. He watched, and for the first time, what he saw did not feel like something fragile, something temporary, something that could disappear with the wrong move. It felt stable. It felt real. Mai glanced up briefly, meeting his gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, as it had been from the very beginning. She did not ask for approval. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply returned her attention to the children, continuing what she had been doing without interruption. That was when he understood. This had never been about proving something. It had never been about succeeding where others had failed. It had been about something far simpler and far more difficult to replicate. She had stayed when everyone else had left. He stepped into the room, then, his presence no longer altering the atmosphere, no longer tightening the air, but existing within it without disruption. One of the twins looked up at him, their expression calm, their posture relaxed, and for the first time, there was no distance in their gaze, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just quiet recognition. Kang Jae-min held that moment longer than necessary, something in his chest shifting in a way that did not belong to power or control, something that did not require him to act or respond. It simply existed, and as the evening settled around them, as the light faded and the room remained filled not with noise, but with a quiet that had been built, not forced, he finally understood something his world had never taught him. Respect was not something you demanded. It was something you earned by staying when it was easier to leave. And that day, in a house built on power, dignity did not ask for permission. It was recognized.